I would like to talk today a little bit about skepticism, particularly as it relates to science and kind of what skepticism is and how to engage with it responsibly. So I like skepticism. I'm a bit of a skeptic myself about most things, very skeptical about any claim that I hear, because people lie about stuff all the time. And even if they're not outright lying, they can fabricate data, they can exaggerate things, they can leave things out. It's very easy to hear things that sound like they could be true, and then you hear a really good counter argument like a week later that you never even considered, and it totally blows your mind open because you're like, oh my God, like I believed a lie. And then maybe a week later you hear a rebuttal to that counter argument and you're like, oh my God, no, the thing that I originally thought was the truth and the counter argument was actually deceptive, and then we can go back and forth. And so trying to find the truth is hard. It's a difficult process, and so I understand why people are skeptical of things, because people out there will lie, and there's money and there's all kinds of interests and stuff. So let's talk about what skepticism actually is. So skepticism is not the same as just denying things. Skepticism ideally is that you hear claims and you are critical of them, and you're skeptical, meaning you don't believe them immediately, and you're rigorous with your research, and you're very critical of them, and you challenge them, and you push back, and you try to give counter arguments and really kind of pressure test the idea. But there has to be some level still of evidence. There has to be some bar with which you go, okay, you know what, this actually seems like I will entertain this as being true. There has to be a standard of evidence that would satisfy you. That's what skepticism is. That's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be just not being gullible. Skepticism is not reflexive denial, though, and it seems like a lot of people today use the term skeptic or say I'm skeptical to really mean they're just a denier of something. They're not really open to hearing about it. They don't really understand all the arguments for something. They're just they hear something and they're like, I just don't believe it because these people are lying, or there's a conspiracy. And when you ask them, well, what's the evidence that these people are lying, or where's the evidence for a conspiracy, they go like, oh well, like there just is one. Or like, oh, well, just like these people get paid to do something. But everybody gets paid to do something. Every researcher is paid on both sides of the aisle. So money cannot be the only argument for why you think that there's a conspiracy. People who are pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine, there's a lot of money on both sides. People who are pro-climate change, anti-climate change, there's a lot of money on both sides. So money is not the only thing. You have to really look for evidence that there's a coordinated conspiracy if you want to say that people are lying about something. So skepticism is not supposed to be denial, but most people that I see calling themselves skeptics today of the vaccine or of climate change or something tend to be just deniers of it. And whenever I kind of press them and try to ask about their deeper understanding of the topic, they seem to not actually be able to articulate the arguments for climate change, or the arguments for why maybe, the vaccine does not have microchips in it or is not intended to kill people. It's not like they've really scrutinized and done a lot of really in-depth research and can give the steelman position of why climate change is real or why vaccines are okay. They just believe that these things are bad or they don't exist, and there's a big conspiracy behind it, and they just don't. There's no standard of evidence that would convince them otherwise, because they really just don't know what they're talking about. And it's okay to not know what you're talking about, but you should admit it. You should just be able to say that you don't have an opinion on something. Like that Joe Rogan episode where Candace Owens was on there, and she was really confident and really smug, and she said, Joe, we don't need to worry about the environment at all. And he was like at all? And she was like, not one little bit. And she laughed, and she's so confident, so smug. And when Joe pressed her on why do you not think climate change is real, she was like, I just don't believe it. I just don't see the evidence. I don't think it's true. I just don't think, And he's like, well, what about this? What about that? What about that? She's like, I just don't believe it. I just don't believe this. I just don't believe this. And it became clear very quickly that Candace Owens actually had absolutely no idea what she was talking about. She could not tell you what the current level of carbon concentration in the atmosphere is. She could not tell you how far back our record goes of CO2 levels on the Earth that we measure in ice sheets. She cannot tell you any of the information or data really on either side of the climate change topic at all. And eventually Joe kind of forced her to concede. He was like, why don't you just not have an opinion then? It's okay to just not have an opinion. Instead of just so smugly being like, it's not real. And she was squirming and being embarrassed and weaselly. But she basically conceded that she was kind of like, yeah, I really don't know anything about this.
And
you don't think we have to care about the environment? Like, what do you,
no, not even a little bit. Like,
not even a little bit?
no. Okay, let me clarify this. I don't throw trash on the ground. Like,
Okay.
I'm not saying like we need to like, trash the environment. Like, but do I believe in climate change? No.
Okay, but this is an incredibly complicated subject.
Right.
And if you would have to talk to a bunch of different scientists and see how they gather data and see what they understand about CO2 levels and what's the danger of them and what can combat it and what could not. Have you done all this, or
No,
do you
so I
take
think-
this flippant opinion
listen,
based on the
I'm
party
not. This
line?
is not. This wouldn't be the hill I died on, right? But it's not about the party. I just genuinely, I've read a ton about it, but
What
I
have
would
you
not
read?
be able to. I would not be able to come to you and say like, this is my strong opinion. But
So my question to you is, if you want to step outside of the scientific consensus,
Right.
which is vast and involves 10,306 scientists, and just say, I don't believe in it,
Yeah.
even if you're right, you don't have enough information to say that.
right, no,
You might be
but that's why I
correct.
said this is the
But
whole
you're
point.
saying you don't believe
I
it.
don't. Yeah, I would have to have someone sit down and convince me that it was real. I personally don't believe it. That's okay.
But why?
It's good to start at a
here's the
place of
thing.
not believing something.
No, it's not.
You think you should start with believing everything.
No, it's not believe either or. Not believe yes, not believe no.
Yeah.
But don't say you don't believe.
Yeah.
Learn about it.
Yeah.
Learn about it and then have an opinion. But you're stating this opinion without having any real understanding of
Right.
what climate
Well,
science is.
but that's exactly what an opinion is.
I understand what you're saying, but what I'm saying is that you are a very smart person,
Yeah.
and people listen to you, and they're going to listen to you for a long time.
But this is what I hate. This is what I hate.
But hold
because
on,
then
let
it's
me
like,
finish
Candace,
what
you
I'm
have
saying.
to have a formed opinion on everything.
No, you don't have to have a formed opinion
Yeah.
on everything. What you do have to have is the ability to know when you don't know what the fuck you're talking
But
about.
I just said that.
You
I
don't
thought-
think we have to care about the environment? Like, what do you,
No, not even a little bit. Like,
not even a little bit?
no.
And that to me seems to be kind of the general feeling I get from the skeptic community on most issues, is whenever you drill down into it, the heart of it seems to be that they've seen enough people argue for something, and the people who were arguing for it were being kind of mean or kind of shitty about it. And so they just go like, I'm just not going to believe whatever they're saying out of spite. And that's pretty much, that seems to be most people. And I don't blame people. I mean, it's if you have enough people coming at you, telling you something, and they're being dicks about it, and that's, that does make it difficult for humans emotionally to want to hear people out and, understand that maybe a person can be a dick, but maybe they can also be right. And that's a hard thing to face. But I think that a thing's truth value should not be contingent upon are the people who are arguing for it nice or not. And I don't like the fact that a lot of people who are big proponents of climate change. They are pretty snarky about it, and they do sometimes embellish things. And I do admit that hurts the movement and the arguments. But I think on the other side, people that are very skeptical of things like climate change should also do their due diligence, and they should really do some research and kind of figure out the numbers and be able to talk substance, because almost none of them that I've ever spoken to can. If I start to bring up numbers and stuff, they just completely shut down. They have no idea, and they always just kind of resort to, well, I just don't believe like Greta Thunberg and all these like liberal hippie blah 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 whatever, and it becomes arguments about the people and not about the substance. So just to recap, skepticism should just be being good at critically thinking and challenging topics. Skepticism should not be just outright denial based on emotions, but that's what a lot of skeptics seem to be like. So let's talk about something called selective scrutiny for a minute. Selective scrutiny is whenever you are really skeptical and critical of one group of people and not of another. And so, for example, what people will say is like, I don't believe all the scientists who say climate change is real. They're all lying. They're all in on a big conspiracy. It's all a bunch of fake hippie nonsense. But then somebody like Alex Jones will have, one scientist on his show who will say that actually climate change is not real at all. And then those same people will go, well, I believe that guy. See, he's telling the truth. I totally believe he's the expert, like he's the real scientist, whatever. And it's like, how do you know that guy's not lying? And so this is what I mean by they're very scrutinizing of this group of scientists over here. But with the other group of scientists, they are not critical at all. They don't go out of their way to look up counter arguments. They just believe immediately because they want to believe these other scientists. People's selective scrutiny kind of reveals to you their internal beliefs belief and what they want to be true. If you hear something and your first instinct is to believe it, it's because on some level you already kind of believe that thing is true and you want it to be true to confirm your own schema. But if you hear something and your first instinct is to immediately be like, hang on, and you Google like how to debunk this argument, that's revealing that you don't want that thing to be true, or you already believe it's not true, and so you're going to go out of your way, you're more motivated to disprove it. And so selective scrutiny reveals your pre-existing beliefs. And so if you want to be a true skeptic, you have to be equally critical and equally scrutinizing of any claim, any scientist. If you're really skeptical of these 10 scientists, but you automatically believe anything these 10 scientists say, you're not really a skeptic at all. You're just an ideologue, and you're just tribalistic, and you're just mindlessly placing your faith and trust in one group of people over another group of people based on essentially nothing, and that's not real skepticism. The other thing that skeptics will say is like, well, I don't trust science. I don't trust experts. They tell us to trust the experts, but these experts, they're all lying, and they're these ivory tower elitist people, and I don't trust them. I don't trust the science. And then so they act like to place your trust in science or in experts is like misplaced and naive. And certainly sometimes it can be, because obviously sometimes, specific scientists and specific studies and beliefs can be wrong and are proven wrong all the time. The problem is that we all place our faith in science, in some scientist somewhere, because what will happen is like a person will say, I don't believe this study that says that climate change is like this. And I keep referencing climate change because that's the most prevalent thing, I think, these days. But I mean, it's true with healthcare. It's true with any policy. I mean, a person can bring up a policy for Medicare for all and say, oh, this study says that this country that has Medicare for all works really well. And then a person can be like, well, I don't trust that study. And they're like, here's this other study by this scientist that says the opposite, and I trust this study. And so anytime that a person doesn't believe a study, they're always going to have a counter study that is also done by an expert with science. And so no matter what, there's no way to escape. Like, the only way to disprove science is with other science. The only way to disprove a study is with another better study that is also done by an expert. So no matter what you do, you are placing your trust in the hands of hopefully PhD scientists, experts who know more than people like me or you who spend their entire lives researching stuff. It's just a matter of which one you want to place your trust in. But either way, we all believe in science. Science is just the process of having a hypothesis about reality and then doing tests, hopefully with really rigorous, good methodology, and then seeing if those experiments or those tests end up supporting your hypothesis or not. And then hopefully that process can scale, and you get a lot of scientists doing that process, and they're all peer reviewing each other's work, and they're like replicating studies and improving upon their methodology each time. That's ideally how science is supposed to work. And I think on some level, all humans believe in that process because there is no better way to arrive at truth than hypothesis and experimentation done over and over again by lots of people getting better each time. I can't think of a better way that we could ever attempt to arrive at truth about reality. We all like science. It's just a matter of which scientists you actually want to believe and place your trust in. Which then brings us to a very important question, which is how do we determine which scientists, which studies, which institutions to place our trust in? Because as lay people, we can't devote our lives to researching epidemiology or the intricacies of climate science. I mean, we just don't have the training or the time or the know-how. So we have to trust somebody somewhere else to like collect the samples and do the stuff for us. How do we determine who do we trust? And that's a really good question. And I would say it's true that what skeptics say, it's true that just because there's a majority does not mean that the majority is inherently right. That's absolutely true. A majority can be wrong. A majority of scientists used to believe that the earth was flat, and now they don't, and so obviously majorities can be wrong. The thing that determines truth is not the number of people that believe it, but it is the methodology, and it is the substance, and it is the arguments. And who has the better arguments whenever you get down to substance? Who has the best substantive arguments? And those arguments have to come from the results of studies that are empirically done, which then comes down to which studies are done with more rigorous, thorough methodology. And that's where it gets, even more kind of esoteric, because as a person who is becoming a trained scientist myself, and I've done a little bit of research, I can tell you that it's really easy to BS research. It's really easy to do things like data cleaning and what we call p-hacking, and there's stuff that you learn about to not do, because if you get caught doing it, you lose your credentials and your career's over. And as scientists, we need to be people that have a commitment to the truth, and we want to have integrity. But there are researchers and people out there that will botch data. They will leave things out. Their biases might leak through in their research. So even if they're not intending to lie, the kinds of ways they phrase questions, the kind of places they go looking for data can color their research and kind of put it in the direction that they kind of want it to go, even unintentionally. Other times it's a lot more direct, and people will just outright fabricate data. In data cleaning, they'll leave out data points, or adding data points is more rare, but at the very least they'll leave stuff out. And the methodology with which you conduct science is really difficult, because there's all kinds of third variable problems called confounds, and there's stuff that can interfere in your experiments, where if you have two scientists who were determined to kind of get opposite results on the same experiment, they can find a way to just sort of bend and color their questioning and their methods and their biases and all their stuff, and they can get very different results from the same study, because people are biased, and people, even if it's unintentional, that can still happen, and especially if it's deliberate and intentional, that will definitely happen. And sometimes it's not easy to look at the study's methodology and see what's wrong with it, because there's just lots of things that you would never even think about, especially as an untrained person in science, that we just read a study and go, oh, it's just probably true. But maybe there's stuff that was this very subtle sleight of hand things that we're not going to notice. And of course, most people don't even go that deep. I mean, nobody reads primary sources, because even if they could access them, which most of them are behind a paywall anyway, but even if they could, they wouldn't know how to read a scientific paper. And so most people basically just read headlines. And that's what most people mean when they say they do their own research. Maybe they watched a podcast one time, or they read a few headlines or a couple journal articles or something, and that's the sum total of their research. But most people never have direct access to really vetting the methodology of how science is actually done. And so this kind of brings me to the point of where what I said earlier, while it's true that just because a majority of scientists believe a thing does not inherently mean that the majority is right, in today's day and age, with the rigor of the process of peer review, the process of replication of studies, and the process of doing meta-analyses, which are basically taking dozens or hundreds of studies and compiling them all into one giant mega study to kind of put all the data points on one massive bell curve and sort of take the median of all the studies to get the range of the truth, because each individual study might have a margin of error, but the idea is that if you combine a bunch of studies together that all are hopefully peer-reviewed by scientists and replicated, and which makes the methodology a lot more rigorous. The idea is that if you combine all these studies into one thing called a meta-analysis, that's going to get you the highest probability that we can kind of arrive at what the truth probably is going to be a meta-analysis of really high quality research done by dozens or hundreds of scientists all over the world, all competing with each other, trying to poke holes in each other's studies, having that natural process. Science has a self-correcting mechanism built into it that when it's done properly, and the more hands it has to pass through, the more likely it is that all the errors are going to be caught, and so the final result is going to be more likely to be true than if you just look at one random study. And so obviously the first line of defense when trying to figure out if a thing is true or not should be the actual arguments and evidence. But if those arguments and evidence become too complicated, or it comes down to things that we don't really understand, I personally do place my faith in scientific consensus purely for this reason. Because the odds of one scientist being able to lie about something is pretty high. One study being wrong, that can happen, whether it's deliberate or unintentional, just biases influencing the study. It's pretty easy for one study to be wrong. Even 2 or 5 or 10 studies can be wrong. But when you start to compile hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies that are each being done by trained PhD scientists who have spent decades of their lives doing this stuff in research labs all over the world at various universities, public, private, in every city, in every state, in so many countries scattered around the world. They speak different languages. There's not some coordinated conspiracy communication between these thousands of scientists and all their grad students and all the lab workers. That's just not possible. And when you look at the sum total of all of these people's studies that have been, rigorously challenged and vetted and peer-reviewed and replicated, and they're all arriving at the same or very similar conclusions, independently of each other, that suggests to me that we're getting pretty close to what the picture of reality actually looks like. And then you compile all those studies, and then you look at the meta-analysis, and you look at what the bulk of the literature says. So if you imagine like a bell curve, and all of the data points are all kind of here in the middle, and there's some outliers and some stuff out here and some stuff out there, but you look at the vast majority, like 90% of all of the data points point to like this line, and there's stuff scattered out, but it all concentrates here. That is probably going to be the truth, or at least the closest thing to the truth that we can arrive at. And so that is what scientific consensus is. It is the sum total of the work of all the scientists in the entire world putting together all of the information independently of each other, and then looking at what that literature, what the consensus is. And that's what I do place my faith in, because even if there's 5 or 10% of scientists outside of that consensus, the probability, the number of hands that this other data has to pass through is just vastly more, and there's way less opportunities for bias and just outright lying and p-hacking and stuff to come into play. I think we should generally go with this scientific consensus unless we have very good reason not to. And what would that very good reason not to be? Well, better science that suggests that the majority consensus is wrong, which has happened in history. Of course it's happened, but you have to present that evidence. You have to have your own studies that are done extremely rigorously, and you have to have multiple studies and a separate pool of scientists who are doing studies that say the opposite is true. And those studies have to be better, and they have to disprove or counter the other studies in a way that is more convincing and that just does a better job at showing that actually there's something that all these other scientists were missing, and here's the actual truth. And if the arguments are better, if the methodology is better, if the substance is better, then obviously the minority of scientists will turn out to be right. But it has to come down to the substance. And that's the thing that a lot of skeptics and, science skeptic scientists, the kind of counterculture scientists, the people who are like, the majority's wrong, I'm this, there's 10 of us in the world that know the truth. These people are generally quacks. Yeah, I'm not saying it's impossible for them to produce good work or whatever, but generally speaking, every time I've ever looked into the real arguments behind why, actually the vaccine's a conspiracy, there's microchips and it actually kills way more people than COVID kills, you're better off not having the vaccine, or climate change is actually not real at all, we don't have to worry about carbon dioxide at all, people have no influence on it, carbon levels are changing because of the Milankovitch cycle or volcanoes or other stuff totally unrelated to people. Anytime you look into this stuff, it's really easy to debunk it with substance and arguments and fact, and it becomes overwhelming pretty quickly. And I will make videos in the future where I deep dive these topics like vaccines, like climate change, to really explain the substance that I'm talking about here. But yeah, I would just say that the way to disprove science is always with better science. It's never to say we throw out science altogether, we give up on science, we give up on experts. No, you just need better experts doing better science. That has to be the path forward. And just in general, it's easy for one person to lie. It's a lot harder for, 20,000 people spread across the world to all lie together and all fabricate their data to say the same thing, and there's no leaked calls or emails and there's no evidence of conspiracy. The probability of that happening is just infinitesimally lower than there being a few scientists over here individually that can produce bad work and lie. So in general, the more hands and the more eyes that a thing has to pass through, and be vetted in order to be released, the lower the probability that that thing is going to be false or there's going to be holes in it. Unless you have very good reason to believe that there's a highly, coordinated conspiracy within the institution to do that. But again, the more people and the more thinly spread they are, and especially once you start to span multiple countries and stuff, that starts to get really, really hard to prove. And at a certain point, I think you have to kind of wake up to reality and go, you know what? I think maybe this stuff is true. I think that this work done by the 1,000 scientists here that has all been peer reviewed is probably true. And this work over here that was done by 10 or 15 scientists, probably more likely to be false. But again, it all should come down to substance. There should always be some standard of evidence, some bar that if met would convince you of a thing's truth value or of its falsehood. You should never go into a topic emotionally convinced that it's just, I know it's not true, or I know that this is true. You should always go into it as a true skeptic, meaning that you are critical of ideas and you're willing to genuinely and in good faith contend with them to see which best idea is left standing at the end. So the majority could be right, the minority could be right. It all comes down to who has the better arguments, who has the better data. And in the true heart of being a skeptic, you should be equally skeptical and equally scrutinizing and equally critical of all scientists, all experts, all data, and all claims. So by all means, be skeptical. Be skeptical of science. Be skeptical of anything anybody tells you ever. But be a responsible skeptic. Be a good faith skeptic. And always ask yourself, what would it take for me to be convinced that I'm wrong? This has been How to Engage in Scientific Skepticism Responsibly. Thanks for watching.